For centuries, the final resting place of King Richard III was one of England's biggest mysteries. After his death in the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, no one knew where he was buried. Over the years, stories, rumors, and myths about his burial site spread, and many people were left wondering, where did Richard III go? What if the answer had been hiding all along, right under our noses? It wasn't until modern times that the truth finally came to light, solving a mystery that had lasted more than 500 years. The Battle of Bosworth in 1485 was a turning point in English history. King Richard III, who had been the ruler of England, was defeated and killed by Henry Tudor, who would soon become Henry VII. Richard's death ended the reign of the Plantagenet family and opened the door for the Tudor dynasty to take over. After his death, Richard's body was taken to Leicester and put on display for the people to see, a sign of his defeat. But this public display marked the beginning of the mystery surrounding his final resting place. Where was he buried? No one knew for sure. Records from the time suggest that Richard III was buried at Greyfriars Church in Leicester, but there was no monument marking his grave. Over the years, this site became harder to find. In the 1500s, Henry VIII ordered the destruction of many Catholic churches, and Greyfriars was torn down. A mansion was eventually built where the church once stood, covering up any trace of Richard's burial. By the 1600s, a story began to spread that Richard's body had been thrown into the river and buried under Bow Bridge. This rumor led to a plaque being placed at the bridge to mark the spot, but the story wasn't true. Richard's grave remained lost in time. In 1611, historian John Speed wrote that Richard III's body had been dug up and thrown into the river by an angry mob after the destruction of Greyfriars Church. There was no real evidence for this, but over time, people started to believe it. By the 1800s, the story was accepted as fact, and a plaque was placed near Bow Bridge to mark it as Richard's burial site. Then, a skeleton was found in the river, and many thought the mystery was finally solved. But tests later proved that the bones didn't belong to Richard III, keeping the question of his true resting place alive. By the 21st century, the true location of Richard III's grave was still unknown, but a group of dedicated historians and researchers wanted to change that. The Richard III Society, a group focused on learning more about the king, believed his body was still somewhere in Leicester. With the help of modern technology, including advanced mapping and archaeology, they began searching for clues. One key figure in this effort was Philippa Langley, who became convinced that Richard's grave was hidden beneath a parking lot in the city. Despite many people doubting her theory, she was determined to find the truth and finally solve a mystery that had lasted for over 500 years. Philippa Langley's search led her to a quiet parking lot in Leicester, a place that didn't seem special at first glance. But as she walked across the pavement, she felt something, an unshakable belief that this was where Richard III had been buried. Then, she noticed something strange. Painted on the ground was a reserved parking space with the letter R. It was just a coincidence, but to her, it felt like a sign. Convinced she was standing above the lost king's grave, she pushed for an excavation. After years of research and persistence, she and her team finally got permission to dig, hoping they were about to make history. The excavation team had little funding and only a small section of the parking lot to dig up, so they had to be smart about where to start. Using old maps, they figured out where Greyfriars Church had likely stood, knowing churches were usually built in an east-west direction. They carefully planned 3 trenches, hoping one would reveal part of the church. The odds of finding Richard's grave were low. After 500 years, his remains could have been lost forever. But as the team began digging, tension grew. No one knew if they were about to uncover a piece of history or come up empty-handed. Just a few hours into the excavation, something incredible happened. As the team carefully dug through the dirt, they uncovered a human skeleton. No one expected to find anything so quickly, let alone something this significant. But as they looked closer, they noticed 2 key details. First, the spine was curved, matching historical descriptions of Richard III's uneven shoulders. Second, The skull had severe damage, consistent with battlefield injuries. These clues were impossible to ignore. Could they really have found the lost king on the very first day of digging? The team knew they had to be careful. They needed more proof before they could say for sure. But in that moment, it felt like history was within their grasp. Finding the skeleton was one thing. Proving it was Richard III was another. To do that, scientists turned to DNA testing. They needed a living relative whose maternal DNA could be traced directly back to Richard's family. That's when they found Michael Ibsen, a man whose family tree led straight to Richard's sister. They compared his mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down to the mother's side, with DNA from the skeleton. It was a match, but they didn't stop there. To be absolutely sure, they ran carbon dating tests to determine the skeleton's age. At first, the results suggested it was slightly older than Richard, raising doubts. But then, scientists factored in the skeleton's protein-rich diet, something only a nobleman or king would have had. With this adjustment, the time frame lined up perfectly. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. After 500 years, the mystery was finally solved. The skeleton in the parking lot was, without a doubt, Richard III. The discovery of Richard III's body was more than just solving a historical mystery. It changed how we see the past. For centuries, his final resting place had been lost, buried under layers of myths and forgotten history. But thanks to a determined group of researchers, archaeologists, and historians, the truth was finally uncovered. Finding his skeleton not only confirmed the details of his death, but also gave us a clearer picture of the man himself. It reminded the world that history isn't set in stone. New discoveries can change what we think we know. Richard III's story, once thought to have ended on a battlefield, continues to shape our understanding of England's past. And in the end, it was a mix of science, persistence, and a bit of luck that brought the last Plantagenet king back into the light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating history discoveries. What do you think about Richard III's story? Were you surprised by how he was found? Let us know in the comments. And if there's another historical mystery you'd love to see covered, drop your suggestions below.